Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is NopNapNarp, and today we're going to be taking a look at a psychological affliction, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD for short. So the inspiration for this video comes from the release of Battlefield 5, but unlike most of the videos in this series, the developers didn't really go out of their way to incorporate a psychological concept or illness into their game. It's just kind of associated with this subject matter. In other words, even though this military game isn't about PTSD, I'm sure the first person you imagine when you hear PTSD is probably a military veteran. At best, this game is only going to show you some conditions that may lead a person to develop PTSD, and you aren't going to see the lifelong after effects, but I still want to talk about both of those concepts in this video. So without further ado, welcome to Psychology of Gaming, the series where we discuss how psychological principles are worked into games and how games can affect us psychologically. So, like I mentioned before, Battlefield 5 isn't designed to show you the experience of living with PTSD. Instead, it offers up an opportunity to look at one situation that may lead a person to develop PTSD. And I say one because while PTSD is most often associated with military veterans returning from war, it is actually a condition that can affect people as a result of many different situations. But before we get into that too much, let's start by first defining PTSD as a psychological illness. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental condition that affects people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event, and often this results in severe struggles with mental and emotional well-being. Reports of PTSD have been around for centuries, but only really began to be studied more vigorously following World War II. It is categorized as an anxiety-driven disorder and affects millions of people all over the world. PTSD is of course brought on through exposure to a traumatic event, but let's be clear that not everyone who experiences tragedy will go on to develop this condition 100% of the time. According to PTSD United, a non-profit organization committed to helping those with the disorder, about 20% of people who witness a tragedy will go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's about 1 in 5 people, and consider this, almost everyone is going to experience some sort of tragedy or traumatic event in their life, and if you haven't or don't, you're just one of the lucky few. What this means is that there are potentially a ton of people out there that are suffering from this condition, and I think it's important that we as a society don't view it specifically as a military-related issue, while at the same time not forgetting about those veterans. That being said, it's certainly not a term to be thrown around lightly. Post-traumatic stress disorder can be brought on for a myriad of different reasons, whether that be witnessing the sudden death of a loved one, or living through any sort of abuse, whether it be physical or sexual, or really just being exposed to any situation that brings about the utmost fear, sadness, and disgust within you. Any event that deeply affects you in a severely negative manner can potentially bring about PTSD. And yes, this certainly includes bearing witness to the high levels of death and destruction that often occur during war. But more on that in a bit. So what does PTSD look like? Well, it can manifest in a bunch of different symptoms. These include, but aren't limited to, panic attacks, paranoia, severe bouts of anxiety, mental flashbacks, withdrawal, and feelings of guilt, sadness, anger, and remorse. Flashbacks are perhaps the most common symptom associated with PTSD, as recurring thoughts of the traumatic event plagues the person's mind and can be very difficult to move on from. These intrusive memories may also affect a person during sleep, which leads to reliving the event as a nightmare. Most of the time, these flashbacks are brought on through triggers in the external world, whether they be visual or auditory. It can be anything really, so long as the person's brain associates the sound or visual with the traumatic event that took place. For example, if a person was in a car crash and lost a loved one in that same crash, hearing the sound of a brake screeching in the distance may trigger that person to relive the memory again. and this obviously would bring about a very negative reaction in that person. Living with PTSD is very difficult because it can feel like you may never escape your memory of the event, and you never know when the next encounter with something that will trigger that memory is gonna take place. So with that background, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Battlefield 5, World War II, and PTSD. Battlefield 5 as a game isn't designed to show off what living with PTSD would be like, but its gameplay gives us an example of an event that may cause this condition to develop in a person if they were actually living through this. I wouldn't call this game the best depiction of World War II in games, but it does give us some valuable insight to what war looks and sounds like. Next time you play a match, whether it be something simple like Team Deathmatch or a much more involved mode like Grand Operations, I urge you to take a minute to think about how the sights and sounds may affect you later on if you were really living through them. Imagine running through war-torn cities or rural battlefields while bullets are constantly zinging past you. All over the battlefield are the bodies of your fallen comrades, perhaps even your friends if you're squatted up with them. Thanks to Battlefield 5's revive mechanic, you can hear the shouts of wounded warriors begging for a medic to aid them as they lie there bleeding out and dying.
Agony! Medic! Oh, bug has got me! Need a medic!
I mean, really, imagine seeing that, watching people in the last moments of their lives gone way too soon. Meanwhile, the incredible sound work clues you in on the pure destruction and carnage that surrounds you at all angles. You hear the sounds of tanks rolling up, buildings collapsing, gunfire everywhere, and explosions landing as your soldiers yell out war calls and gasp for air, clearly panicked as they understand that this might be the end for them. Bearing witness to all of this death and destruction can haunt a person for the rest of their life, and when this haunting becomes recurring and uncontrollable, we probably have a case of PTSD. An estimated 60 million people died during World War II. Take a second to realize how high that number is. 60 million people. There were a lot of people who did survive though, and many of these soldiers had to return home with the memories of what they had witnessed. Now, certainly not every one of these soldiers developed PTSD, but from the research I did, it seems that about 1 in 8 soldiers did. That might sound like a contradiction to the 1 in 5 stat I mentioned earlier, but remember that not every soldier witnessed the actual destruction of war firsthand, and not every soldier saw the bloodshed. And consider this, these stats are only from World War II. From an American perspective, we've been in a handful of wars since the end of World War II, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the war in the Middle East. That's a lot more people who have experienced conditions that are conducive to the development of PTSD, and that doesn't even include members of civilian life who also experience traumatic events. The point is that there are millions of cases of people living with PTSD out there, and so it's important to understand it a little bit better. Video games can give us some insight on what war conditions were like and a visual on some of the events that could potentially trigger PTSD in a person. And while I don't think Battlefield is the best war simulator ever, its commitment to excellent sound design and visual recreations of war serves as a good example for these conditions. And I really hope that doesn't sound offensive to service members. You know, I always think it has to be strange seeing people sitting around playing war games for fun when so many people are suffering on an individual level and a societal level because of war. But again, I know I keep saying it, but please remember, PTSD isn't exclusive to soldiers returning from war. Anyone can develop it from experiencing a traumatic event, but that can only be diagnosed by a trained medical professional, so I urge you to seek help if you are suffering. If you or a loved one is suffering from PTSD, there is certainly hope for you. Older treatments of PTSD often involved having the person recounting the traumatic event, which ultimately may have acted as a deterrent for seeking help. But nowadays, there are a lot of therapy options that involve improving quality of life and helping people disassociate the negative feelings from the flashbacks that they experience. As with any time I discuss a mental illness, I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video to some websites where you can find help at if you or a family member or a friend is suffering from this condition. So I hope this video taught you a little bit about PTSD. Admittingly, I am stretching it a bit here. Battlefield 5 isn't a game specifically about PTSD, but it really does offer up a chance to talk about a condition that impacts millions of people, and anytime we can raise more awareness about an issue, the better chance we have in doing something about it. I appreciate you all for watching. I'm hoping to get out a few more videos before we say goodbye to 2018, including a look at the worst level in Spyro history, possibly a review of the Reignited trilogy, maybe one more Psychology of Gaming episode, and of course, my top 10 games of 2018. I'm really excited to make all those videos for you guys. 2018 has been a great year for the channel, and I want to finish it out strong. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.